From 1774 to 1783, mounting tensions between Britain and the colonies led to the breakout of the American Revolution. This war ultimately resulted in the creation of important documents, the emergence of key figures, and the development of significant military alliances and measures.
Before we begin, let's note that the British issued a series of forced taxation upon the colonies. Eventually, the Americans are outraged and resented against the British's imperial rule. During this time, there was a Whigs who were patriots.
The conciliatory proposition, which was proposed by Lord North of Britain, further strained American perceptions of Parliament. This proposition stated Britain would not tax the colonies if they contributed to the defense of the empire. Americans were unhappy with the fact that Parliament was, once again, aiming to put colonial legislatures subordinate to the Crown. Thus, the Second Continental Congress formally rejected this proposition on July 31, 1775.
Lexington-Concord Battle on April 19, 1775 was ultimately provoked by the tension buildup between the 13 colonies and British authorities in 1764, as well as playing a role in the starting of the American Revolution. The British began to enter Concord from Boston, and soon the two sides confronted in Lexington. Now the fighting has begun, with 700 British troops and 74 militiamen. British continued into Concord, and more Minutemen arrived. But the British tried to keep the colonists at bay. Although the Americans had significant losses, they proved that they could go against a strong imperial power. Finally, the colonists won their independence in 1785 after a series of conflicts. Also, who fired the first shot is still unknown today. In May 1775, redcoats stormed Boston once again, and it was thus that the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress began with the redcoats firing into the Boston crowd in 1775 and the dying of Minutemen during their defense. The Congress appointed George Washington of Virginia to be the supreme commander, who was to serve without pay. The Congress authorized the printing of money to help pay supplies, and eventually the committee began to conduct relations with foreign governments. The main reason for them to build a relation with others is to pave a backup route for themselves in case they ever need help in the future. Now they were a full-fledged governing body. Unfortunately, the majority of delegates were not seeking independence from Britain, with an exception of John Adams.
The Second Continental Congress produced the Olive Branch Petition, which was addressed to King George III, asking him to protect his American subjects from military actions ordered by Parliament. The colonies did not want complete independence from Britain at the time, so this petition was a way of showing the Crown they still wanted to keep a relationship with their mother country.
When talking about key figures, none other than Thomas Paine comes to mind. He was a corset maker with radical ideas, and his packet Common Sense, which was published in 1776, declared King George to be wrong and pushed for independence based on the king's tyranny. He also thought that it was way absurd to suppose a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. On the road to independence, Congress figured out that they had to appoint a declaration committee in order to draft the declaration. On this committee were the important figures Richard Henry Lee, who introduced the idea in Congress that the United Colonies should be free and independent states, and Thomas Jefferson, the Virginian who was the main writer of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson maintained that he did not write any more than what everyone was thinking. When talking about the Declaration of Independence, it is important to note the ideals of John Locke, who developed the contract theory of government, or the belief that governments are created by the people to protect their natural rights, and that the people have the power to disobey the government and establish a new one that will protect them better. This was obviously a contract, and we see this through the Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence was officially adopted by Congress on July 4, 1776. The Declaration laid the political and ideological framework for the United States of America and served as a legitimate justification for America to break away from Britain. The contract theory of government played a major role in the formation of the Declaration. For example, one grievance against King George III was He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people.
Who were the militias? The militias were men in arms formed to protect their towns from foreign invasions and ravages of war.
When Congress established the Continental Army, they figured out that they needed to find a leader. In order to search for one that was effective, they turned to George Washington, and he was nominated by Congress because he was supposed to attract Virginian recruits with his leadership. The book even describes him as having good judgment, understanding of both the uses and limitations of power, and a quiet air of authority, or the gift of command, because he did not risk lives unnecessarily. He successfully led the Continental Army, which was aided by Continental dollars, which was paper money that was issued by Continental Congress to finance revolution, which caused inflation.
An important factor in the British Army were the Hessians. Hessians were 18th century German mercenaries which were professional soldiers hired to serve in a foreign army. In this case, about a total of 30,000 German soldiers fought for the British. They were hired because there wasn't enough British soldiers. Another important fact is that they were sold in units and not as individuals.
Although it is noted that the majority of the fighters in the war were men, it is also important to note the roles of women during the Revolution. There was a legend of Molly Pitcher, who was thought to be a wife of a Continental artillery sergeant, and the legend was that she carried water to gunners to cool them and their overheated guns at the Battle of Monmouth. Overall, women had an exalted and subordinate role during this time. They had to nurture wise, virtuous, and public-spirited men. Mary Silliman represented the dutiful wives who waited for their husbands to return and ended up knowing more about the financial situations of the families than about their husbands. Abigail Adams was the demonstration of another type of woman, a revolutionary. She was the wife of John Adams, who at this time was working in Congress, and she pushed for women's rights through her husband that was in the Second Continental Congress. And these rights were that legal protection and recognition of values, as well as the need for equal views on both men and women applied. We can clearly see her quote in one of her letters to her husband to remember the ladies, and that all men would be tyrants if they could. She even ends with, "I will never consent to have our sex considered in an inferior point of light."
African Americans also had a significant impact on both sides of the war. For the British, they promised black slaves their freedom if they fought with them. For that reason, some loyalist slave owners switched to the Whig side. It attracted mainly blacks in the South like South Carolina and Georgia. However, the British still had racial prejudice against the slaves. They had blacks do construction and agricultural work. For the Americans, at first George Washington rejected the idea of blacks in the army, but after the British offered them their freedom, he had to offer the same deal. Approximately 5,000 blacks fought against the Crown for American independence. The Native Americans also had an impact on the war. At first they favored the British because they were the ones who protected them from the advancing Americans. Their biggest fear was that if the Americans won the war, they'd take all of their land. They tried to stay neutral, but in some cases, like the Iroquois Confederation, they split.
The Battle of Saratoga in 1777 was a turning point of the Revolutionary War. The battle took place in Saratoga, New York, and the commander was General John Burgoyne. From this battle, there was victory. The French signed alliance with the U.S. on February 6, 1778. Now let's talk about Valley Forge. Although there was no battle fought there, it was a turning point of the Revolutionary War. During this time, the Continental Army was ready to quit because they were hungry and beaten. But in March, General Nathanael Greene was appointed head of the commissary department, and food and supplies began to come in. In May, it was the French alliance, and with it was military and financial support of France.
After seeing the Americans win at Saratoga, the French decided to formally accept the Americans as allies in 1778. However, they'd secretly been giving the Americans supplies before since 1775 to seek revenge against the British. Benjamin Franklin was one of the 3 American agents who put forth the alliance in Paris. The French recognized the Americas as an independent country and would fight with them against the British until they recognized that too. The French aided them with money and supplies, and with that also boosted the colonial economy. The French also persuaded the Spanish to give help to the Americas. However, they did not supply as much financial aid, nor did they recognize the Americas as an independent country. The last major battle of the Revolutionary War was at Yorktown in 1781. Washington's army was strongly supported by French naval and military forces. At this point, Britain's General Charles Cornwallis had nowhere to turn and ultimately surrendered. However, the war was still not formally over yet.
After the Revolutionary War, the Peace of Paris was formed. It was signed on September 3, 1783. Among the American representatives present at the signing and overall process of formulating the peace were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. What exactly was in the Peace of Paris? Well, basically, it stated all the territorial successions and gains involving all the countries which participated in the American Revolution. The United States. The United States got everything it wanted besides Canada, which remained a British province. Basically, the territory it gained was virtually all of the area east of the Mississippi River. As far as Spain, all it achieved was the provinces of East and West Florida from Britain, but it did not achieve its ultimate goal of gaining Gibraltar. France didn't gain anything really except for, beating their number one arch nemesis, Britain. That was sufficient enough for them, and they were done with the war. We all know Americans emerged triumphant from the Revolutionary War, but just what exactly was the greatest contribution to their victory? Well, you could say it was George Washington's leadership, which was highly attentive and consisted of good judgment and pertaining to how he ran his Continental Army and how he transformed it from a ragtag team of soldiers to a well-organized, disciplined, and skilled body of troops. Another reason that can be attributed to the victory of the Americans was French assistance. Without their military and financial aid, who knows if America could have withstood Britain's powerful might. In addition, Britain ironically contributed to their own downfall in the Revolutionary War. There was bureaucratic inefficiency, hesitant command, and as well as very cautious military strategies, which ultimately led to their failure. In addition, Britain was fighting a war that was 3,000 miles away from their home. They were fighting in a foreign land with colonists and people distributed over greater than 1,500 miles from Maine to Georgia, making it all the more difficult to capture and fully secure a victory over the large population of people.
What were the effects of the Revolutionary War on society? In regards to women, they had more knowledge about family financial situations, and their public and private responsibilities also increased due to many of their husbands being enrolled in the army. For Native Americans, they were greatly devastated. They had no choice to go with the British after the war, and most of their land and people were either destroyed or massacred. The Peace of Paris resulted in Britain giving up land east of the Mississippi to the Americans, which meant thousands of Native Americans were stripped of their land even without being present at the treaty. For African Americans in the North, black men were able to enroll in the army and even ended slavery there, though it still remained legal. In contrast, in the South, slavery was strengthened because of it being a crucial part of the economy. Many slaves and free blacks also went with the British to the West Indies and even Canada. As far as the economic situation after the war, there was severe inflation and a decreasing paper money value. Prices were up because of the demand of supplies during the war. Also, ordinary people were suffering from the brutal living conditions, and many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite these events, in the 1790s, the colonies once again gained prosperity.